So we're going to keep that conversation going when it comes to the offshore. Where did the money come from? And I know someone who spent some time in the energy department, and he's as knowledgeable about this as anyone that I know. And we're going to lean on him for this in just a few moments as we bring Andrew Younger back into our studio. We'll be right back after this news update. On a Monday afternoon in March, just ahead of the spring sitting of the legislature, lots of conversation about health care, mental health care. Premier today talking about helping get people off the wait list, those who are waiting for a family physician, offering up doctors a bit of an incentive for any names they take off the list. And, well, tomorrow we'll find out what the spending plan is for this government, for this province, for the next 12 months. Was a bit of a surprise on Friday when there was a news release from the Nova Scotia government. Province invests to grow the economy, enhance community supports, saying the province will benefit from projects with a lasting impact, with more than $120 million in one-time funding generated from offshore revenues, helping to expand a number of programs. This is described as a windfall of what some estimates are $245 million. Okay. Where was this money? How did we get it? What is this all about? Andrew Younger can tell us some of what he knows. I'm not sure how much detail he can get into, given that we in this province have a thing called cabinet confidentiality that is for life. Andrew Younger, former politician, former energy minister, former member of government, and today our friend trying to help us understand what the hell happened Friday. What the hell happened Friday?
Well, it's interesting because if you read most of the news stories, it talked about an adjustment in offshore royalties. But what CTV had picked up on was the fact that this came from an arbitration process related to pipeline royalties. And so the way royalties work in our offshore is the companies are able to deduct their costs before we get money from natural gas coming in from offshore. And there has been a long-standing dispute over the value of pipelines, the Maritimes and Northeast pipeline, and how that factors in. It looks like, now this has been going on, this arbitration has been publicly known. It's been going on for at least 3 governments, maybe longer, but it's been going on since the Rodney MacDonald government for sure. And it looks like Nova Scotia won, or at least that's what
we were told.
That's what we're told. And now we've heard lots of numbers. We've heard 120, we've heard 250, 254 million. It's not clear how much the award actually was and how much of this might be extra spending. But certainly it looks like they've taken that money, plus maybe some other money, and spent it on some other programs.
If you and I, Andrew, were in a business together, or we were buying or selling a property, lawyers are involved, money sits in trust. If I sell a house to you, the money that you give me goes through a lawyer. If this was an arbitration, there had to be lawyers involved.
Yeah, there were lawyers involved, and the government has previously disclosed that. They haven't disclosed the amount of money involved, but it sort of became known when the lawyers descended on Halifax, and everybody realized there were some very expensive lawyers in town, energy experts and so forth. So that was acknowledged. As Minister of Energy, I acknowledged it during budget estimates at one point. Previous ministers had acknowledged that it was ongoing. But understandably, that's all any government was saying, because they didn't want to impact the process by talking too much about that. I think it sounds like Nova Scotia's won the arbitration, or at least it's at completion, and I think the arbitration decision should be released so the public can see that and mine over it. But also, I think now it would be the responsible thing to do would be for the government to say, this is what it cost us to fight this arbitration. We all understand there's a cost involved. That was being put on the debt or the deficit, and then ultimately the debt, because of course the province for most of those years was running a deficit. So we borrowed money to pay these legal costs. And it would be good to know exactly what the full accounting of all this is.
And the Conservative opposition has been quick to point out John Hamm plunked the money down on debt. Yeah. Rodney MacDonald spent some of it on debt, some of it on programming. Friday, we were told government had made its decision to invest in a number of different community agencies and groups. Not to say that they're not worthy, not at all saying that it's not important to have high-speed internet if you want to develop rural Nova Scotia. But we didn't have any say. We didn't know this money was coming. Should we get hung up on that?
Well, I think we should. I mean, we're days before a provincial budget.
Well, that's what struck me as odd. Why before budget day is this coming out that there's extra money?
That's right. I mean, it does make a mockery of the budget process. And it's interesting that McNeil used to say that this sort of thing made a mockery of the budget process, too. It makes a mockery because we're not getting to question those programs. I mean, obviously, like the opposition will get to question them after the fact, but what it shows you is it doesn't matter what happens in the 80 hours of budget debate over the next few weeks. The government is approving an amount. Cabinet can change those amounts after the budget has passed, and they can add funding and spend money on things that were never approved. That's very unlike municipal councils, for example. I mean, when council approves a budget, all those large ticket items in new spending or shifting of spending all have to come back to council and are debated individually, with some very small exceptions. So it does make a mockery of it. We should have had some say, especially. I mean, there's some very good things in there, and I don't.
I went through the list going, okay, if I was Stephen McNeil and I was being questioned by a reporter, I'd say, which? Should we not have invested in Nova Scotians with autism? Should we not have dealt with the opioid framework?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
the problem is it's a bit misleading because what appears to have happened is they appear to have got this chunk of money in the arbitration award, which is good. So, they get a bank transfer of some amount of money, and it's not really clear because the provincial government release would suggest it's 120 if you read it one way, but then other reports have suggested it's 250 or 254. So it's not clear whether we got 120 million and then on top of that they're spending an additional 120, or is the whole award 250 or what's going on. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, there were expenses involved in getting to this win, and have they deducted repaying back all those expenses that taxpayers loaned to this process first? We don't know the answer to that. I mean, the opposition parties will still be able to ask this through
doesn't
budget
mean they're
estimates.
going to get an answer necessarily.
No, it doesn't. Now, if somebody filed a FOIPOP request, it would be a lot harder to deny it now that the arbitration has completed, depending on what presumably that arbitration decision is not confidential, because that would set a precedent for future ones. But
if the power utility is cost plus, you were on the program to explain that to us. If we're arguing over pipeline royalties, that's our investment and what we're able to earn from. Is that cost plus as well? By that, can you say then legal fees can come to the province or be charged to the province?
This is this is a little bit different, because basically what it is there's an amount of gas taken out of the ocean seabed, and we get money based on the price of gas, and we get a percentage of that. Now,
does it go up and down with markets?
It goes up and down with markets. Okay. So I mean, if
natural gas did hit a peak and then it hit a valley,
it did, and one of the reasons that our royalties are lower now is because the price of gas has dropped. One of the reasons why Deep Panuke and ExxonMobil are shutting down, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is because gas price is so low, it's not quite as economic as it once was. If gas price was really high, it would make sense for them to push some of those fields. There are gas fields out there that could use the current compression deck, but it's just not economic. But there are other costs. So getting the gas to market, such as the Maritimes Northeast Pipeline, there are certain costs like that are deducted before royalties are calculated. And this was simply a dispute over, without getting into the details of exactly what the dispute over, it was essentially a dispute of what can you deduct before calculating the royalties.
Andrew Younger is in our studio. Just looking back, there's a story here from 2007. Bill Casey, at the time, a member of the Conservative government. It was about the offshore. It was about the offshore accord. Is this tied into that in any way?
A little, not directly. What that was about was the federal government wanted to change Harper wanted to change the rules so that when Nova Scotia got transfer payments, the royalty money that we receive from the offshore would be deducted from those. That does not happen in Alberta. So we wanted to be treated the same as Alberta, and Bill Casey stood up for that at the time.
So that, just so we're clear, it means that this money, whether it's 120, 240 million, whatever, it won't be clawed back.
It won't be clawed back.
Okay.
No.
So regardless, the Premier is up. The province is in.
No, this is good news. Listen, this is good news, and I think we should be happy that we won this arbitration. It would be interesting to know things like, did we win the arbitration, or was this a settlement? Was there a settlement reached, which was certainly a possibility. Mm-hmm. And I think we should have a full accounting of it at this point. And I think it's fair. A lot of people will say, well, why didn't we have a lot more information as the process went along? I think it's fair that the government kept other than acknowledging there was an arbitration without outside lawyers and it was over the pipeline. That's all they acknowledged for the past 8 years or 9 years or so. And I think that's fair because there was it was a legal process. You didn't want to show your hand, but that arbitration's over now. So let's see the full accounting, and then people can weigh whether they can weigh the results.
But as you say, this has been ongoing through successive governments. So does it necessarily? Ultimately, the taxpayers in Nova Scotia will benefit from this, or at least from the programming, or at least some people will benefit from it.
Yeah, Nova Scotia taxpayers benefit. I mean, we are seeing extra cash in the bank, and it can be put on the debt, or it can be spent on programs as we see. There will, presumably, if the way the government is spinning this is accurate, that we have won the arbitration, then that probably means that the amount of royalties we are going to get per unit of gas is going to increase over the next few years. And despite the fact that the projects are winding down, it will mean slightly more royalties than we had anticipated. And that could be interesting because tomorrow's budget will likely have estimates based on the old formula. There's now a new formula, so there actually could be some more revenue. So don't be surprised if when you see a fiscal update in the fall, whether there is a sudden surplus that's higher than whatever they're projecting tomorrow, because that will be one thing that will change.
Karen Casey, quoted by the Canadian Press, resulted in a recalculation of royalties from the gas started flowing in 1999, again, winning an arbitration decision on pipeline transportation costs for shipping Sable natural gas.
Yeah, and that's right. And so if you think about that, that's over 20 years. Right. So it's not an enormous amount of money. There might be some interest in there, but if let's say for the sake of argument that it's $250 million, let's say it's that whole amount they're spending, you divide that by 10, right? And that's how much it is or 20, sorry, because that's 20 years. So it's not an enormous amount per year that this has been recalculated.
$1 million a year, $10 million a year. Yeah, it adds up quickly. But I do want to get back, we need to take a break to that decommissioning thing that we were talking about. And is there still a bill that's pending for that?
Yeah, there is.
Okay. We'll dig into that when we get back with Andrew Younger right after this. Back on the air on this Monday. Oh, if you're the kind of person who has investments and you watch them closely, don't look at them right now. It's here, sell-off underway in North American markets. I'm not laughing. Facebook's taking a huge hit today. This is after allegations of data breaches and probes underway for data practices. Anyways, sell-off underway. Oh, that's a buying opportunity if you're into that.
Excuse me, I got to go run check on my portfolio.
Andrew Younger is in our studio. We're talking about this windfall, and you wrote today on your blog, when a windfall might not be or may not be a windfall. Okay, so whether this money is through arbitration, the dollars are in the bank, we still have an obligation, I understand, from what you've been saying, that when we decommission, Deep Panuke?
I'm not sure about Deep Panuke, but the ExxonMobil platform, so we have an obligation to, in simplest terms, to pay for a portion of the cost of the decommissioning. It's not really paying it. It comes off the royalties. Now, a lot of people say, oh my goodness, why are we doing that? So what happens when an offshore project or really a terrestrial project happens, although terrestrial projects are much simpler, there's a negotiation that happens with the government to determine how royalties will be calculated. That's what we just went through in an arbitration on a dispute over what had been agreed to.
I say it's this, you say it's that.
That's right.
Somebody else decides what's fair.
And there's almost always an arbitration clause rather than going to court, because arbitration, even though it can be expensive, is still cheaper.
Government likes arbitration when it comes to this.
They really do. But one of the things they do is they decide what costs are included and what are not. Usually, the decommissioning of a project is included as an allowable expense, or a portion of the decommissioning anyways. And they would have reached an agreement back, this was probably in the 80s or the early 90s, I guess, the agreement would have been finalized. And that a portion of the decommissioning costs, the future decommissioning costs, would be removed. Now, the government puts money away in a reserve on paper, predicting what the cost of that decommissioning would be. But what makes this one interesting, and most projects, is you never really know what the environmental regulations will be or what the costs will be. And of course, over 20, 30 years, the costs increase. And so A couple of years ago, we learned that the decommissioning costs would be coming sooner than we thought and would be more expensive than we thought. And one of the reasons is there's a very, very large barge with a crane on it, I guess is the easiest way to put it, that takes the top sides off these platforms and returns them to land. And there's only one or two of those around in the world, so they're very expensive to book.
Andrew Younger is in our studio, and we're talking about the windfall, the money. Government announced last week it got through an arbitration hearing process over offshore revenues and what it's going to cost us to put things back to right. You're a diver?
I am, yeah.
I was flipping through Netflix, and there was a story talking about the dive platforms, oil drilling platforms. They're saying they're like natural coral.
Yeah, they're great.
Really?
Yeah. So one of the disappointing things here, and one of the things that will cost us more, is that we will require in Nova Scotia that the entire platform be removed, cut down probably to the seabed level, capped and brought ashore. There was some discussion, and interestingly enough, the Ecology Action Centre at the time was very interested in this, in looking at what they do often in Europe, where they take the top sides out, cut the platforms off at a level that is below a navigation hazard, and then leave the legs. And the legs become artificial reefs, which is obviously good for fish and so forth. That currently is not permitted here or is not allowed, and nobody pursued that too far. So there are benefits. It saves money. It's also a huge environmental disturbance to actually take these things and cut them off the ground.
I just thought it was fascinating that I hadn't thought of that.
In Texas, interestingly, in the Gulf of Mexico, you can go diving on some of the active oil rigs. Less so now, since obviously
this was
terrorism
a fishing
and all that.
This was a fishing show, so this was about fishing.
Listen, you can fly over the Gulf of Mexico in a helicopter. You see the fishing boats very close to the oil rigs for that very reason.
Andrew Younger's in our studio. Are we done with the money? Is that it for offshore money, for revenue, for royalties, for everything that has been in the pipeline, that is in the pipeline, that may still be in the pipeline?
Well, there'll be some royalties coming over the next few years. I mean, they're still pumping out gas seasonally on Deep Panuke, and ExxonMobil is still pumping out gas at the moment, although it is winding down. There are no projects on the horizon at the moment. Everybody's aware that BP and Shell have some exploration projects going on offshore. Those are for oil primarily. I mean, if they hit gas, that's great, but gas is really cheap at the moment, so it's hard to make the case on offshore gas. We actually have around Sable Island, very close to the Mobil project, some gas projects there. They're called significant discovery licenses. We know the gas is there. It's found. Somebody just has to put a pipe in and tap it, but it's just not economic.
I was going to say they have to make the case to wherever they're getting their money from, whether that's the corporate overlords or the people that finance these types of things.
And you can only do that for oil at the moment. And as much as people say oil is dead, it's not. It might be on its way out for vehicles and cars over the next 10 or 15 years, but people often forget that we use oil to make a lot of other products like plastics, coatings for things that go in wind turbines, and all kinds of other things. So there are other uses for oil. We'll see what happens. I mean, but there's a lot of money being invested in offshore exploration. The problem in somewhere like Deepwater, Nova Scotia, which is where Shell and BP are working, it really is like a needle in a haystack. You know, you're taking a straw and you're putting it in the ocean, and they're hoping that they hit a find. And they need a very large find to make the economics of that work too.
With Andrew Younger in our studio, the province was quite pleased to announce Friday it had this extra money for program spending. We'll see what comes to the budget tomorrow. Do you suspect they'll want to put aside a few more dollars for more exploration?
Well, the government doesn't pay for the exploration. The government does offshore atlas work, and I'm sure they will continue to do that. That allows us to know what the geology is out there, and it could potentially have benefits that go beyond oil and gas. The United Nations, through the Law of the Sea Convention, has done a lot of work on offshore mineral exploration. Magnesium nodules was a big thing for a while. knowing the geology around is good for a whole lot of reasons that go beyond oil and gas. It would be useful even for offshore renewable energy platforms and so forth. So that kind of thing, I think we'll still see investments in, and I think it's not very expensive in the scheme of the budget and probably makes sense. But I think tomorrow's budget will be, the questions anyways, will be about healthcare and education, most likely.
And mental health care.
Yeah.
And fracking, is that conversation over in this province, do you think?
Oh, yeah. It'll come up. I'm sure it'll come up in the legislature.
Well, I'm just thinking with millions of dollars on the table from royalties, somebody will say, look, we're leaving money on the table.
We are, but the question is, and we've had this discussion before,
Yep.
it's economics. And at the moment, there is nobody banging on the door asking to do that work in Nova Scotia, because even the latest report downgraded fairly substantially the amount of probable gas available. And then you have to take beyond that a percentage of what is actually economically viable to get at. Then you need to have a community that's willing to take it. And then the government has to spend money to set up the regulatory agency to operate it. So are people going to accept spending a couple $1 million a year to set up a regulatory agency to monitor what may or may not result in revenue, or do they want that couple million spent on healthcare and education? I don't think the government is in a position where it will want to spend the money on the regulatory agency.
Budget day tomorrow. The budget's already signed off on.
No, the budget's signed off. It's
Yeah.
going to pass. They have the majority. And I think that the spending in the past few days points to how silly the 80-hour debate will be, because they're not getting details. All the questions will be about last year. They are called estimates for a reason, because by September, the budget will look entirely different than it started. It's much like a throne speech. A budget is used to, in many ways, just predict or to make announcements. They got some announcements out of the way during March break last week. They'll get a few more tomorrow. I'm sure they're running a surplus, so they will be. I think you
happy to report that.
They will be very happy to report that, and they must be running a decent surplus, because they could have, the money that they spent last week could have given them a surplus equal to that amount for closing out the year's budget.
Right.
So they are very clearly running a decent sized surplus for last year, and I'm sure they will predict the same for this coming year. Question is, what do they use that for? Because the debt has been growing, and I know a lot of people say it's cheap to borrow money at the moment, but there are also fewer and fewer people paying taxes and less amount of tax money going in, which is going to create a fiscal challenge very soon.
And we know it's millions and millions of dollars are paying on interest to service that debt.
Well, we are paying it, and we have fewer people in lower incomes that are actually paying tax money in to cover that. If your personal and corporate tax revenue is growing faster than your debt, then that might be okay, but it's going the other way.
Andrew Younger, always appreciate your insights, and thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
We're going to take a break, and first-time home buyers. We'll talk with Ken Shea about that on Money Matters after this. Money Matters after this. Money Matters after this. Money Matters after this.